Hey, so what was really up with the discovery of the Americas? Alright, so I'm asking this now in particular due to a recent discovery from this year. I was actually planning to make a video on this a few months ago and it didn't pan out, and I'm sort of glad it didn't since this helps me to drive home the point even more. So just this year, May was the earliest reference I could find, but I'm sure Italian sources would have had a few months earlier, so possibly sometime around the start of the year, it was discovered that there was a very interesting passage in the Chronica Universalis. The book was written in the 1340s by a friar from Milan named Galvano Fiamma and describes a land to the west of the known world. I quote, "Beyond Norway there is Iceland, further ahead there is an island named Groenlandia where the polar star remains behind you towards the north. Further westward there is another land named Markalada where giants live. In this land there are buildings with such huge slabs of stone that nobody could build with them except those huge giants." Now don't take the giants thing too seriously. Accounts of far-off lands like this always get messy and rumors fill in the gaps of knowledge with every retelling. If you dig back far enough, you'll find legends of giants in Africa and the steppes. Hell, at one point, quite recently, Europeans even thought that there was an entire mountain range running across Middle Africa that didn't exist. However, the important thing here is not the specifics, but that the tales of a land across the sea to the west of Iceland and Greenland had managed to filter down to the Mediterranean about 150 years before Columbus would ever set sail. So how did this filter down? Well, if you were in school for the last 20 years or so, you were probably just starting to hear about how there was evidence that the Norse had contact with the Americas, however brief. Well, that information was from the 60s and the 70s when L'Anse aux Meadows was first discovered. Since then, we've been learning a lot more about the relationship between the Norse and the Native Americans that lived along the Atlantic coast. Though L'Anse aux Meadows was thought to have been a short-term settlement, it's clear that there were occasional voyages to the mainland around modern-day Newfoundland. In fact, once more just this year, through AMS dating, researchers were able to prove that lumber was cut by the Norse pretty close to exactly 1021 AD. The map isn't incredibly clear on where these samples came from, but matching it up, I believe they came from this site just to the south of L'Anse aux Meadows, which makes sense. In fact, we know that the Norse encountered and even traded with the natives of the Americas, and especially the Thule people, which are the ancestors of the modern-day Inuit, due to the fact that many Norse artifacts ended up far beyond the range of where they were known to have settled. In fact, the Norse even had a name for the natives of the Americas. I've seen many say that it would pronounce similar to Skraeling, but it's also possible the pronunciation was closer to Skaling. Even though they used it interchangeably to discuss any natives of the land, today it is most often applied to the Thule people or the Beothuk people, as those were likely to have been the two groups that the Norse would have had the greatest contact with. So obviously the stories of the Americas made their way down to Galvano through word of mouth all the way from Greenland. Genoa was a port city after all, and it's not unreasonable to think that these tales may have crossed from merchant to merchant all the way down from northern Europe. But what else of the Americas? Were they always isolated before Columbus? Before the Norse? The further back we tread in history, the more murky everything becomes and the more difficult it is to find trustworthy primary sources regarding anything. But that's exactly where the most fun parts of exploring history can be found, so let's at least take a look. So what's up with sweet potatoes, right? Like many things we consider a staple of our diet these days, sweet potatoes were actually originally a crop from the New World that many of our European relatives would never have had the chance to taste. However, by the time that the New World was discovered, sweet potatoes were already a native crop of Polynesia. In fact, it's been suggested that the crop might have been introduced to central Polynesia as early as 1700 AD. Is it possible that the plant floated across the entirety of the ocean to take root in Polynesia like a wayward coconut? It's possible, though some have also noted the similarity in the word for sweet potato between Proto-Polynesian languages and the languages of South America. Compare Proto-Polynesian Kumala, Eastern Island Kumara, Hawaiian Uala, and Maori Komara against the Runasimi and Aimaran Kumar et Kumara, and it becomes clear to see why some people might believe that there is a connection between all of these various languages. It's important to note that when I say some people believe this, I am not speaking broadly about people on the internet or some small fringe academic. I am speaking specifically about a well-regarded Dutch linguist who has had his specialty in the field of Native American languages, especially those around the Andes. His 2004 book, The Languages of the Andes, is well regarded in the field, and as of 2019, he is a member of the Academia Europaea. Does this mean that this is hard proof of a connection between early Polynesia and the Americas? Of course it doesn't, but it's worth noting that those suggesting this connection are some of the best in their field, and clearly it's an avenue worth pursuing at the very least. Of course, as with every major discovery in world history, you will have every country in the world scrambling to claim the title for themselves. Everything from Mormons claiming that ancient peoples from the Old World had made the crossing as early as 600 BC, to ancient Judaic contact, to claims that even those in China or Africa made the journey first. Even a briefly lived theory that ancient Phoenicians might have made the journey as early as 600 BC. Of course, many of these end up being forgeries at worst, or merely lacking in significant evidence at the best. As we've seen, even though the Norse obviously spent a significant amount of time in the Northern Americas, it can be difficult to find substantial evidence, and especially up until recently, evidence of very specific dates. However, there will always be some vague evidence to pull from if there has ever been contact at all. At most, we could hope for a voyage drifting across the ocean, accidentally disappearing across to the vast continent to the west. As good as lost to the sea for any written sources of the time, and unable to impact any future DNA testing, and very unlikely to leave behind any significant artifacts. On the topic of ancient contact with the Americas, though, there might actually be evidence of Roman contact with the Americas, even if only through that scenario presented previously of ships drifting and wrecking upon the Central American coast. Again, the evidence here is very circumstantial, but if we're going to be speaking about the origins of contact with America, it's worth bringing up. Even if this is the case, however, it certainly doesn't indicate that the Romans actually discovered America in any given way. In 1933, a terracotta head was discovered in the Toluca Valley, southwest of modern-day Mexico City. This head appears to sport European features, including a very impressive beard. Now, a thermoluminescence test in 1995 proved that the head was produced sometime between the 9th century BC and the 13th century AD. Quite a range, but certainly within the range where it might have been possible for it to have arrived on the American shores before modern European contact. It's worth noting that there have been objections to the way the dates were described, but no further testing has been done to disprove the current dating as far as I was able to find. More than likely, this artifact was either planted as part of a hoax, or it is merely an object that existed alongside the pottery found beside it, which was dated between the late 1400s to the early 1500s. The ambiguous dating of these finds happens to fall just along the colonial period of the region towards the end of their dating periods, making it very difficult for it to ever be proven definitively if this head came from either before the colonial period or during the early colonial period. Another recent find that presents significantly stronger evidence in an unlikely place comes from Alaska back in 2016. Now, I say that it's unlikely, but really that shouldn't be the case, considering the Bering Strait is where many consider that ancient peoples originally crossed from the Old World to the New. Discovered in an ancient Arctic dwelling were two artifacts of metal, a bead and remnant of what appears to be a belt buckle, possibly one that would be used to secure strappings to horses. Dated to about 700 years ago by the leather strap that the buckle was still attached to, this would put the artifacts arriving in the Arctic around the early 14th century, almost 200 years before Columbus. X-ray fluorescence testing appears to show that the artifacts were made from a heavily leaded alloy of lead, copper, and tin. Most likely, the artifacts were forged somewhere in Central Eurasia and then traded upward through Siberia and eventually across the Bering Sea to the Thule people. Yes, the same Thule as when we were talking about the Norse. The range of their people and culture was certainly very impressive and contributed largely to the future groups of peoples that would inhabit all range of the Arctic, replacing the earlier Dorset culture as they went. I'm extremely excited to see where this research will lead, as both Siberia and the Arctic are criminally under-discussed for how interesting they are. So what does all this tell us about the history of the New World and its contact with the Old? Well, it tells us that, as it stands, the most consistent recent contact would have come from the Norse around the early 11th century. That, of course, lines up with modern interpretations, but it was always going to. Until significant physical or genetic evidence is put forward that can link other groups to the Americas in a time period before this, it will always be the case that the Norse were the first to the New World and certainly at least the first Europeans to truly settle on the American shores. Still, just because there is no great exchange and settlement does not mean that there weren't isolated events that might forever be lost to time. Whether a Roman ship drifting across the sea, or Japanese sailors pulled across the ocean by the Kuroshio currents, or brief contact between South America and Polynesia. Don't be surprised to see the origins of contact between the Americas and the rest of the world rewritten over and over again as time goes on. So thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. The point where history gets murky and old enough to bring up these fringe possibilities with even the smallest amount of supporting evidence has always been the most enjoyable to explore for me, and I plan to do much more so. The Americas in general are a ridiculously rich vein to mine from, despite the obvious difficulty that comes with attempting to pin down any specific histories between many areas. Still, if there are parts of history that you would like me to dive into, or any interesting topics you think I would enjoy covering, please do let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you again soon.